And start recording. Okay, so here we are. It's the 3rd of December, Thursday, and this is week 15. We're having team presentations, and the first team up is Only Clams. Take it away, Only Clams. Somebody should share their screen.
Give me 1 second.
Sure.
What's this one? Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my notes out, but it's not letting me. Okay. Our presentation is on overfishing and coral reef ecosystem impacts and management strategies. Team is Only Clams. So next slide. This is the outline and objectives. The purpose of the project is to explain the issue of overfishing, particularly in coral reef ecosystems, and explore the environmental impacts, focus on the ecosystem and marine life, the socioeconomic impacts, as well as the response to mitigate the issue. Next slide. So defining overfishing, which is the removal of fish from body of water at a rate that species cannot replenish, which exceeds maximum sustainable yield. This often happens because the ocean is an open access resource that is non-excludable, leading to overexploitation of fisheries. There's no regulations on who's able to fish, and relatively anybody is able to, who has a boat and equipment, can make the decision to fish. Next slide. Why overfishing happens. With the increasing demand for seafood, it creates a growing market, and everybody wants to benefit off of this economic benefit. And also overfishing happens because the ineffective fishing regulations that are in place. One example are fishing limits placed on fisheries. However, this is faulty because individuals will attempt to catch the most amount of fish before the catching limit is reached and the fishery is shut down. Also, ITQs, where they're individual transfer quotas, which creates marketable property rights for fish. However, this is not economically efficient, and we're not able to stop overfishing through these means. And then next slide, we have this distinguishment between artisanal and industrial fishing, which is important to note because industrial fishing is what contributes to the destruction of environments and overfishing, as it has industrial grade equipment with large crews, and industrial technology has increased the improvements of fishing numbers. Meanwhile, artisanal fishing has little technology and is practiced by coastal and ethnic communities. Next slide for technology. Technology has revolutionized the fishing industry, and it threatens artisanal fishing communities. It has maximized the yields, where it has contributed a lot to overfishing. I think I'm done. So.
Okay, so this next section is on environmental impacts and their impacts on overfishing and the effects on coral reefs. So the methods that the fishing industry uses have led to bycatch and the destruction of marine ecosystems, such as these coral reefs, as well as the decline of several of these species populations. So trawling is the method that the commercial fishing industry uses the most. And this is the process of dragging huge nets across the ocean floor to catch mass amounts of these targeted marine organisms all at once. And this process destroys the ocean floor. So this picture on the right is actually one of the boats that they use. So there's like little weights at the bottom of the nest that like take the net all the way to the bottom and help it go across. And this process of trawling leads to bycatch, which is the catching of unwanted marine organisms during commercial fishing. So the other picture is a sea turtle, obviously, which is one of the organisms that is sadly caught up in the bycatch process. Next slide, please. So things like nets, traps, and marine debris can be stuck in coral reefs and damage them. through all this commercial fishing. And there's this thing called indiscriminate fishing, which catches herbivore fish by using these traps and nets. And this can lead to the overgrowth of marine plants because obviously the herbivore fish aren't there to eat the plants, which isn't a good thing. And overfishing in inshore reefs doesn't allow for marine organisms to reach adulthood and replenish their populations. So there's little population and species turnover or turnaround. And I believe that's all the points I wanted to make. If you want to go to the next one.
Sorry, I was muted by accident. So impacts on sharks is huge. Sharks are one of the most important keystone species to maintaining a healthy marine ecosystem. They are directly and indirectly affect all levels of the food web, directly by controlling prey population as well as the population of smaller predators, and indirectly through the intimidation of its prey, which leads to a population distribution and leads to a healthier plant marine ecosystem, which is very important in a coral reef community. Next slide. Roughly 100 million sharks are killed annually by human. This is either intentionally or as bycatch, like from trawling. Attaining accurate data from this can be difficult because it is fishery dependent, and not all fisheries will disclose all this information. And because of this, it makes conservation strategies difficult. One way to combat this is by tagging and tracking highly migratory sharks and using satellite telemetry. This way you can get fishery independent data. Next slide. Shark fin soup is a big killer in sharks. It is considered a delicacy in some Asian cultures. And out of the estimated 100 million sharks killed annually by humans, it is estimated that roughly 73 million are killed solely for their fins. And although it is illegal almost everywhere in the world, 145 countries are known to practice in this act. Hong Kong and China are actually the main importers of shark fins, and together they come up with 94% of the black market trade. It is also scientifically proven to have no nutritional value, so it is just completely pointless. And shark finning is the #1 contributor to the decline of sharks, and it can lead to the extinction of many species if it's not controlled soon. That's it.
Okay, so we've seen some consequences towards the physical environment and ecology in coral reef ecosystems due to overfishing. But why is this important for humans? Well, coral reef ecosystems have high social and economic value. When it comes to social relevance, fishing in many coastal communities is more than just a source of income. In many cases, the fishermen in coral reef communities also find a place they can belong and be part of. This resulting livelihood, however, is what causes difficulties when trying to stop overfishing, as this added social value to fishing makes it more unlikely for fishermen to leave the fishery. One potential problem from overfishing to society is the widening of the gap between people of different economic status, as when the shore is overfished, richer fishermen can get to afford a boat and the fuel to go further offshore to fish in places where fish have not been depleted yet, while poor fishermen have to stay in the shores that have already been overfished. Next slide, please. Overfishing is also a relevant issue because of all the economic benefits that coral reefs provide to communities. These benefits stem greatly from the ecosystem services they provide. For example, recreation and tourism produces about $35.8 billion in the US. Next slide, please. And yeah, the ecosystem services are also very important because of climate change. For example, coastal protection is an important ecosystem service provided by coral reefs, which is expected to become more and more important as there are more frequent and intense storms. And disease is also expected to increase due to climate change. Thus, the biodiversity and the potential to find pharmaceutical compounds in coral reef ecosystems will be more valuable as time progresses. So from this, we can see that coral reef ecosystems are very valuable, but the overfishing in the ecosystems is leading to their deterioration and to the loss of ecosystem services, resulting in major economic consequences. Yeah, I'm done with my points.
Okay, and so my section was on human responses to overfishing. And so as overfishing continues to become a more prominent issue, humans have made significant changes in order to mitigate these the effects of overfishing on the environment. And one of these responses was when the United Nations gathered all the world leaders into a single room to discuss maritime law. This was a meeting called the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, or better known by its acronym UNCLOS. And so UNCLOS was a driving force in the reformation of the commercial fishing industry, and has actually reduced a lot of the harmful effects that overfishing has had on the environments in which they affect. And specifically with UNCLOS, Article 62 grants local governments the power to set restrictions on commercial fishing in their specified zones. So some of these restrictions include like closed fishing seasons, bag limits, size limits, and fishing quotas. And with some of these restrictions, the restrictions that have been imposed have also caused the fishing techniques and equipment to be altered as well. One of the main issues in current fishing practices is that most of the fishing equipment is non-selective. So as previously stated, the bottom trolling, which is when they have the weighted nets that go down onto the seafloor and kind of just drag across in order to catch a lot of fish. They've been trying to get rid of those since in the process of capturing all those fish, the weights on the nets tend to destroy and flatten out all of the things that they pass over, including coral reef ecosystems. So it causes a lot of damage to not only fish populations, but also to the environments and all of the populations that are on the sea floor. And then in conclusion, overfishing greatly impacts coral reef ecosystems through destructive fishing practices and disruptions to the food web. The destruction of these ecosystems affects society and the economy, as coral reefs are important for many communities, as well as provide a lot of important ecosystem services. And several responses to combat overfishing have taken place, including the establishment of international treaties, such as the one stated in UNCLOS. And that's pretty much it. And then these are our quiz questions. We also had like a technical difficulty. I'm not sure why, but it skipped over one of our parts. So I'm just gonna go back to that really quick. Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. So some impacts of overfishing on marine life. Overfishing can lead to extinction of many species that call coral reefs their home. It also exacerbates current problems that climate change is causing, such as coral bleaching and ocean acidification, and makes it worse. The fishing methods they use, like trawling or the traps, as well as some like dynamite fishing, damage coral. So not only are they dealing with things like coral bleaching and ocean acidification, they're also getting their habitats physically destroyed as well. Herbivore species are getting overfished heavily in coral reefs, and this can lead to high levels of algae, which smothers coral reefs and takes away nursery space and habitats from other species. And predator species, like Brandon said, when they're overfished, they can have trouble with prey population control as well as prey population management. You can go to the next slide.
Got 2 minutes left, so.
Okay. Also, fishing has kind of made an artificial selection on fish by humans. Overfishing has caused fish population size to shrink, as in like the length of the fish. And this is a big problem because large fish have different roles than small fish in coral reefs. An example would be the parrotfish in the Caribbean. In sites that were heavily fished, about 70% of the fish are under 11 centimeters long versus 25% in minimally fished sites. And there was a heavy correlation that sites that had no medium or large level parrotfish had about 4 to 10 times as much algal biomass, which led to heavy degradation of coral reefs, which is also adding to the damage that fishing methods do to coral reefs. I'm done.
Okay, great. Why don't you go back to your conclusion slide? Any questions from the audience? We've got about a minute or two here. Questions? I have a question. How widespread is overfishing? How many different, fish stocks are overfished? Is it a common thing? Is it more than half, less than half?
I'm not sure what the total population of fishes that are overfished, but I know that I read something that said 75% of North American fish populations are overfished.
Okay, and can you give an example of a fishery that has, been impacted heavily by overfishing? What stock? Are there some different stocks, some different examples?
I think it's the orange guppy or orange, what's it called?
Ruffy?
Ruffy, there you go.
Orange
Ruffy, yeah, that one is definitely being overfished, where they're so common or they're still being fished while their populations are just not able to reproduce sustainably.
Right. And then cod also is a big example of an overfished stock, the Atlantic cod.
Cod and bluefin tuna.
Cod and bluefin tuna. So I would have liked to see some more sort of specific examples of overfishing in here. But you've covered a lot of material, and thanks for your presentation. Any other questions from the audience? If not, we'll go on to our next presenter. So you can stop sharing your screen, please. And next up is the Planeteers. So are the Planeteers ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, Planeteers, get your screen up. And so there are only 3 of you, or are there more?
There should be 6.
Okay, yeah. So there's another one.
Sorry.
No worries, Gwen. 2 more though are missing, right?
I'm here.
Carolina, okay. All right. So who's sharing the presentation?
That's me.
Okay, go ahead, Carolyn.
Okay. Just one second. Okay, so hi, we are the Planeteers, and we're presenting on the anthropogenic impacts on coral reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. But before we talk about how human activity affects coral reefs, I'm going to talk about the biology of Florida coral reefs and why they are so susceptible to climate change. So a coral is actually composed of multiple organisms. There's the skeleton of the coral, which is made of calcium carbonate, which is then covered in a living tissue coating composed of many small coral polyps. These polyps are responsible for secreting nutrients and calcium carbonate into the skeleton to maintain and further build the structure. And then living within that polyp tissue are algae cells called zooxanthellae, which photosynthesize to produce energy for both themselves and the coral polyps. This relationship is symbiotic, so in return, the coral skeleton provides shelter and protection for the zooxanthellae, and these are also what gives the coral their bright colors. Here we've just included a map of some major reefs in the Gulf of Mexico, but it doesn't show the Florida Middle Grounds Reef. That's off the west coast in Florida, and is home to some stony coral that can survive colder waters. That being said, Florida reefs were at their peak 6,000 years ago during the Holocene thermal maximum. And as the Holocene progressed and the temperature in the Gulf decreased, the reef accretion in this area basically stopped. And then when modern climate change began further destroying these reefs, pollution and ocean warming eroded the reef structure further, leaving the Florida coastline susceptible to erosion. I've included a few pictures from the USGS that show Key Largo reefs over the past few decades. The USGS describes the Florida reefs as senescent, which basically means they're just deteriorating currently. You can see in these pictures that a lot of the physical coral structures have not only been bleached, but largely eroded away. And along with providing a barrier to coastline erosion, coral reefs are also habitat for millions of different marine organisms. It's actually estimated that around 1/4 of global marine organisms rely on the reef habitat in some way. Along with being so diverse, they're also incredibly fragile. So as little as a 1 degree Celsius change is enough to bleach some species. And today we're going to discuss the implications of those bleaching effects.
So the zooxanthellae that lives, like Caroline said, they live in the coral tissue and they're responsible for that color. So to the right, you can see the difference between like zooxanthellae present and when it's not. So like the color compared to the white. In the picture below that, you can actually see the zooxanthellae like still present a little bit. And then you can see how when coral tissue is stressed, it actually expels it. So that's why it turns that white color. Stressors can include environmental changes involving rising temperatures due to an increase in carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, which promote ocean acidification. This severely reduces the health of the reef and makes coral more susceptible to diseases. It also limits their lifespans as well. Without the production of its main supply of nutrients, the coral skeleton is difficult to grow or even maintain for generations, causing the reef to bleach and later die from starvation. This can explain why there has been a decrease in the concentration of coral reefs around the world. A study was conducted to investigate if ocean acidification and warming have had an effect on the survival of a specific kind of coral reef called Bacilloptera acuta. In this experiment, the mean averages of coral health assessments of different environmental treatments, such as the control acidified, heated, and heated acidified treatment groups, were conducted during periodic checks in the months of July 2017, October 2017, January 2018. Different colors of pigmentation were indicated by red, which would mean normal, yellow is pale, white, which is bleach, and black, which was represented as death. The most bleaching and death of the coral came from the heated acidified treatment group, then compared to the treatment groups such as control or acidified, which had no heat increases.
So alongside anthropogenic coral bleaching and ocean acidification, another way humans are actively destroying coral reefs is by physically damaging the coral reef by fishing practices like trawling. Bottom trawling is particular and the most damaging kind of trawling, as it occurs when large weighted nets are dragged along the ocean floor with wheels to let them move freely and large metal gates to capture fish and other crustaceans. This takes place in the Gulf of Mexico in deep sea coral communities where much research still needs to be done. So there needs to be efforts to preserve these reefs. On the two images on the right, the upper right of the slide, you can see the pictures taken by the NASA Earth Observatory, where you can see exactly where the shrimp trawlers leave a path of destruction. Although these fisheries are told to avoid areas with deep sea coral communities, this is not always the case, and damage to coral communities is often seen. However, as of as recently as October 15th of 2020, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration passed protections for 13 new deep sea coral reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. The images on the bottom right of the slide show the protections on the left, and on the right are the known total coral reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. As you can see, there's still much more protection needed until all the deep sea coral communities are protected, but we're on the right path. However, trawling is not the only source of physical destruction towards coral reefs. Ship and other vessel groundings can cause tremendous amounts of damage to a coral reef. This is most common in the Florida Keys, where the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary reports over 600 vessel groundings each year. These groundings can cause an estimated 19 acres of coral reef damage each year. The issue with this damage is because the corals can take centuries to grow. It can take a matter of seconds before they're destroyed by a careless boater. Because boater registration has increased sixfold in the Florida Keys since 1965, this trend of physical destruction shows no signs of stopping. A famous incident that brought to light how important it is to stop this destruction was the grounding of a freighter called the MV Wellwood, shown on the top right picture. It ran aground on the Molasses Reef in the Florida Keys in 1984. It sat for 12 days until the Coast Guard was able to remove it. Although this grounding was the cause for the formation of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, it's important to educate people about what can happen to a coral reef if a vessel runs aground, as shown in the bottom right picture. Yeah, that's it. Next slide.
All right, overfishing. Coral reefs act as a rainforest of the ocean and are home to different species of aquatic life. The coral acts as a breeding ground for many species such as sponges and sea turtles, as well as many other species of fish. Overfishing leads to the depletion of many of these species. And in the infographic that you guys see, you see the fishing nurseries, which catch young fish before they are able to replenish the populations, which leads to depletion. And marine debris, such as lost nets and lines that damage the coral reefs, and they take a long time to get back and recover to their original starting place. And then you can go to the next slide. Over 75% of reef fish species decline in abundance and 50% decline to less than half of the original numbers. The greater the dependent species have on living coral as juvenile recruitment sites, the greater the observed decline in abundance. And red snapper have been one of the species that we have seen successfully make a comeback thanks to efforts from the Environmental Defense Fund and other catch policies that are in place.
So in addition to the damages done to the coral reefs themselves, destruction of these habitats will inevitably result in economic harm. Coral reefs are a significant source of revenue for coastal communities. As we can see in the top graph, the economic value of these reefs vary by region, but remain important across the board. The data in the second graph shows the revenue per visitor by recreational activity, and we can see that various forms of tourism is generally very important for local economies. Additionally, coral reefs act as a barrier for natural disasters, and without them, the coastline is at risk of erosion. Mass coral bleaching threatens property and health of the community, which will result in further economic damage. Losing coral reefs will also cause a dramatic decrease in the biodiversity of that area, which will threaten local businesses, fishery, and the food supply of those communities. Investing in the protection of coral reefs is vital to the health and economy of local communities and the world at large. And next slide, please.
Sorry, it's loading.
Speaking of, there are many laws and policies put into place to protect the Gulf of Mexico and its coral reefs, which include but are not limited to the original Fishery Management Plan of 1984, which is the historically original policy put in place to protect the reefs from things like overharvesting, destruction, and it works on rebuilding populations and adding more federally protected species. The Magnuson-Stevens Act of 2006 also puts catch limits on protected species and puts into place legal repercussions of going over those limits. The essential fish habitat requirements, habitat areas of particular concern, and the adverse effects of fishing amendment defines what essential fish habitats are, which are those waters and substrate necessary to fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity, which includes coral, of course. It defines habitat areas of particular concern as those areas of ecological importance, sensitivity to human activity, developmental stress, and the rarity of the species that they have. And the coral and coral reefs of the Gulf of Mexico Amendments 1, 2, and 3 continue to define and limit total allowable harvest time and permits necessary for gear used in those areas of fishing and access to those areas where the coral are living, as well as the management of harvesting corals. And an important legal case related to this topic is Gulf Restoration Network versus Jackson, which sets a precedent for small organizations to enact change within larger organizations such as the EPA. And in this case specifically, the Gulf Restoration Network essentially bullied the EPA into establishing necessity determinations of pollution in waterways that feed into the Gulf of Mexico.
To conclude our presentation, anthropogenic impacts such as physical destruction, bleaching, and overfishing have caused detrimental and severe negative effects on the biodiversity that depend on coral reefs. Evidence from the studies that we've shown show evidence that supports coral reefs have health effects and have been in serious danger. Over the past generation, methods to decrease these impacts have been enforced but not widely practiced. Organizations in the Gulf of Mexico have fought to create ways to help the damage from overfishing and tourist traffic caused by humans in coral reefs, such as the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council and the Gulf Restoration Network. These organizations have devoted their resources to educating the public and have shed light on the importance of the protection of our oceans. Some other organisms that expand broader to help this issue include Global Coral Reef Alliance, Oceana, and Ocean Conservancy.
Conservancy.
Conservancy, yes, thank you. Sorry, my dog. I'm so sorry. Without coral reefs, humans would not be able to thrive off the economic and environmental services that they provide. Organisms that depend on reefs would either go extinct from the failure of adapting to the new environmental changes or be forced to adapt to other services of food and shelter, exhausting the resources that were once plentiful. The percentage of marine animals that survive off coral reefs will become extinct, disrupting every line of the food chain. As you can see in this food chain, each and every organism depends on the thriving of coral reefs. So if coral reefs were to become greatly impacted and decrease in our ecosystems, each one of these organisms would be affected. As a collective unit, humans understand that nature is important. However, they do not comprehend the severity their actions play in the survival of wildlife for future generations in marine life. Compassion and deep understanding, along with reinforced healthy habits, need to be faithfully practiced in order for a change to spark in the prosperity of our coral reef or ecosystems.
Okay, so that concludes your talk. Are there questions from the audience? We got a minute or two. No questions. Okay, I have a couple of questions. So what are marine sanctuaries and how many marine sanctuaries are there in the Gulf and how do they protect corals?
So I know there are, obviously the main one is the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. I know there are many protecting the deep water reefs in the Gulf of Mexico as well. As of that meeting or that announcement in October, that I know it passed 13 more, but in total, I don't know. But basically the sanctuary prohibits fishing and at least tries to prevent the destruction of reefs. However, in circumstances, I know that tourism can have an impact on the actual health of the reef.
Okay. I mean, there's also the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, which is a healthy coral reef in the Texas, Louisiana waters. So that's another coral reef, and that's an example of a marine sanctuary that works pretty well in protecting the health of their corals. That's a pretty healthy coral ecosystem, and has been for quite a few years. So that's something you could have talked about. Okay, and then your questions here. What is being killed when coral is bleached? What is the active bottom trawling? Okay, all right, great. Any other questions? Well, thank you for finishing on time and doing this. Our next presentation will be by the Aquatic Junkies. And so are the Aquatic Junkies all here?
Yeah, I'll be sharing my screen.
Okay, go ahead, share your screen, and I'll start the timer for you.
Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about the melting of permafrost in the Northern Hemisphere, and the release of stored greenhouse gases and what it means for just our future, specifically just the future in regards to climate change and the release of greenhouse gases and global warming. So to start off, permafrost. Permafrost is a frozen layer of soil containing organic matter, rock, and sediments. So it's actually right underneath the active layer. A lot of times the active layer and permafrost get confused. The active layer is actually the layer of soil that seasonally thaws and refreezes during the seasons. And it actually is the layer that kind of transmits heat down below to the permafrost. So below it is the permafrost. It's been frozen anywhere from 2 years to 1,000 years. And it can be from anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 feet thick. And just to put it in perspective, 24% of the Northern Hemisphere landmass is exposed permafrost or underlain permafrost. So that's like 9 million square miles of permafrost in the Northern Hemisphere. For context, Greenland, the outer skirts of Greenland are permafrost. Most of Canada, Russia, a lot of different countries are, a majority of their land is made of permafrost. So organic matter such as plant material and animal remains get trapped in the permafrost when it was frozen. This has the potential to release up to 1,500 billion tons of carbon. That's actually double the amount of carbon than what is currently found in our atmosphere today. So as of now, the permafrost is a carbon sink, but pretty soon with permafrost thawing and melt, it can actually turn into a carbon source and has the potential to release a lot of carbon. So like we talked about in class, a positive feedback loop is basically when a action in a system kind of exacerbates, I guess, another action that in turn affects that first action. So basically the thawing of, so basically global warming extends the active layer. So it actually makes the active layer thicker, which melts permafrost, and that in turn releases carbon dioxide, which contributes towards the greenhouse effects, which in turn creates more global warming and more thawing of the permafrost. And so it just creates a feedback loop that we eventually need to work to remediate, or else it will be really destructive towards our environment.
So climate change is defined as the permanent changes that are being made to weather patterns and global temperature. This is due to the greenhouse gas effect, which is where the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap solar radiation, and then that in turn heats the Earth's surface. The release of these gases come from microbe and archaic decomposition. One of the gases is methane, which is seen in the image. It's those round white bubbles, and these methane bubbles stay frozen and then thaw out, they like pop on the surface and then release all of the methane. And by 2100, it's estimated that if the warming trend continues as it is today, 40% of the world's permafrost will be warmed or thawed out. The next slide, please. Sorry.
All right, so the shrub population within the tundras are being affected by global warming, and this essentially affects permafrost thawing as well. So shrub populations flourish during spring and summer months in the tundra, but now since global temperatures have gone up, it's affected the temperatures during winter months, so it's a lot warmer. So now there's a lot more shrubs during the winter months in tundras. And in turn, this decreases the thermal conductivity of snowpacks, which essentially means it leads to warmer temperatures within winter soils. And this affects permafrost in the sense that permafrost is more likely to thaw at a faster rate than it was decades ago, since the winter soils are going to be warmer than they used to be. So it accelerates the thawing even more. Also, the already limited biodiversity of vegetation is further constrained because vegetation in the tundra is already limited as it is. But if shrubs take over, then the essential vegetation that's the like underdog in this case is going to get cut out because of the shrubs taking over. So next slide.
So the scientific consensus of permafrost thaw shows the greenhouse emissions from accelerated permafrost thaw to be irreversible. Permafrost holds the amounts of carbon dioxide and methane that was mentioned earlier, and that's all going to be released into the environment when it's thawed. Methane is found to be between 20 and 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide because it traps more solar radiation, which then in turn heats the earth. And it's also extremely flammable, which is shown in that image. The way permafrost thaw adds the carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere is through the microbes in the soil that release the carbon dioxide and carbon, and the aerobic archaea, which are the single-celled organisms that break down the organic matter. They release the methane. And next slide, please. So there's still further research that has to be done for the future because the scale of permafrost thaw has never been seen in history. The exact portions of carbon dioxide and methane that are going to be released are still unknown, as well as how much exactly carbon dioxide and methane is still trapped in the permafrost. So there are also different bacteria and diseases that have been frozen for many years that are now thawing out and affecting the local communities. And there's some slides later on that touch on that as well. But overall, it's impossible to understand the exact scope of all the consequences on Earth.
Yeah, so in order to accurately study the permafrost thawing, scientists have been using satellite data and other satellite and ground-based observations in order to determine surface changes or deformations in the high latitude regions. And they're also using thermal sensors in which they bore holes into the ground to measure the thickness of the permafrost layers. And up until recently, pretty recently, there has been fairly little studies involving the abundance of the carbon emissions and associated microbial abundances at certain depths in permafrost. Therefore, in a study highlighted in an article published this month, actually, from the journal Applied Soil Ecology, scientists collected soil from a peatland in the permafrost region from 0 to 150 centimeters. And then they incubated the soil at 5 and 15 degrees Celsius for 55 days under anaerobic conditions. And as you would think, throughout the incubation, results showed that at the higher temperature resulted in a higher emission of CO2 and CH4. But interestingly enough, the depths from 0 to 40 centimeters had the highest rate of CO2, and the depths of 40 to 80 had the highest rate of CH4 emissions and ultimate cumulative CO2 amounts. So next slide, please. So additionally, A new study led by some researchers from the University of Eastern Finland and the University of Montreal, in cooperation with researchers from some other Nordic research institutions, they found that frozen peatlands strengthen the permafrost carbon feedback by adding to the atmospheric CO2 burden post-thaw. So they did this by creating intact soil and plant systems like the one that you can see in the photo here. These scientists were able to simulate the permafrost thawing under near to natural conditions. And the dynamic greenhouse gas fluctuations were monitored by a high resolution flow meter through gas measurements combined with some detailing monitoring of the soil greenhouse gas concentration dynamics. And the study found that under dry conditions, peatlands actually strengthened the permafrost carbon feedback by adding atmospheric CO2. Next slide.
All right, so for local relevance, this can imply the collapse of infrastructures that lay on top of permafrost layers, and this can affect countries like Russia, Greenland, Canada, etc. There's also a loss of species within the tundra, given that most species depend on the cold biomes and stuff. So it disrupts the entire dynamic of the biome once the permafrost thaws away, which will in turn affect species. There's also decreased soil moisture, which also plays into the loss of species. As for global relevance, there's an increase in greenhouse gases, an increase in global temperatures, and an increase in sea level rise that can range from 1 inch to 4 inches. And there's also a possible release of lethal diseases like ancient diseases. So next slide. All right, so this is actually an example of a lethal disease that escaped through permafrost. So in the summer of 2016 in Siberia, this rare bacterial disease called anthrax escaped from a reindeer carcass, and it was just one reindeer carcass. It caused the death of 2,300 reindeers in Siberia, as well as the rehabilitation of 90 people. So these people had to quarantine, and surrounding areas also had to quarantine. And keep in mind that this was just one reindeer carcass. So we're like, that was one disease. Once the all of the permafrost thaws away, we don't know what would happen. Like there could be really lethal implications for everyone on Earth. So next slide.
Yeah, so as we have outlined in our presentation, this issue is clearly a result of global warming. And many people have their villages and towns built on top of permafrost. And when the permafrost melts, it has like the potential to destroy like tons of homes and infrastructure, including like roads and bridges and stuff like that. And besides the structural integrity, like the indigenous people have a lot of emotional and cultural ties to the land that's being threatened. And in terms of plausible solutions regarding the stability of these civilizations, our team had proposed the idea that if there was some kind of like scale in place that could measure the rate at which the ice was melting in relation to like the structural integrity and how it's degrading like of the land surface, then maybe people would have an idea of a concrete time that they could get their affairs in order and essentially like get out of there, as well as possibly placing some sort of ordinance that like restricts people from further developing on the land. And morally, as human beings, we're the ones that are living and exploiting our own planet, so that we feel that we have an obligation to do our part in helping alleviate the issues that we're causing, which includes the thawing of the permafrost. And although overall, moving towards clean energy, sustainable agricultural and fishing methods, and putting a price on carbon emissions are just a few large actions that we can take to cut down on our carbon emissions and help provide a longer future for the Earth. Next slide.
These are our questions.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're done. Any questions?
So COVID-19 could be a permafrost could have escaped like anthrax, I guess is what you're saying. Interesting.
No, I don't think so. I just put it as a true and false. I don't think it unleashed through permafrost. You know what? Who knows? I don't even know.
Okay, well, no, you can ask the question. Okay, well, interesting talk. And I guess, is there anybody at FSU who's working on permafrost? Were you able to talk to any of the other researchers here? Because I know Dr. Spencer's lab does a lot of work on permafrost. And there are a couple of, did you get a chance to visit with any of them?
No,
I don't think we know.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let's see. So I was a little of the whole discussion of how shrubs are impacting the permafrost. So you're saying that the shrubs are like behaving like an invasive species kind of, or how?
During winter months, yeah.
Okay.
During winter months, because like they're usually, you know, spring and summer is warmer months, but now since winter is also experiencing warmer temperatures, the shrubs, like there's a lot more shrubs, and it's affecting the temperatures of the snowpack, which, you know, has an effect on permafrost because snowpack's like directly above like the surface.
Okay, so it's another one of these feedback loops. I think you've done a good job of illustrating the kind of different feedbacks that are sort of accelerating the loss of permafrost.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for your presentation. And we have one more to go. So that would be the last one to go is the Tiktaaliks. Are the Tiktaaliks present? There's Mary.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Go ahead and put your presentation up. We have 20 minutes left, so everybody's on good form. I'll start your timer going now.
Alrighty, well, good afternoon, Oceanography 4017. We are Group 5, otherwise known as the Tiktaaliks, and today we will be presenting about the effects of sea level rise on coastal mangrove forests in the Gulf of Mexico. So the purpose of the research that we wanted to conduct was to identify the effects of sea level rise on mangrove populations. We decided to work with a tangible timescale of about 80 years, so we're looking forward to the year 2100 with most of our results and statistics. Our group also wanted to stress the importance of mangroves as mitigators and habitat protectors, as they are crucial to the biodiversity of many coastal states in the Gulf of Mexico. We also wanted to bring attention to economic and societal effects of the degradation of mangroves. And lastly, we wanted to talk a little bit about policy changes and next steps to make sure we are mitigating and working with sea level change with not only policy, but just in general to protect mangroves.
Mangrove forests grow in coastal, saline, or brackish water only at tropical and subtropical latitudes near the equator because they cannot withstand freezing temperatures. There are 3 main species of mangrove that inhabit the Gulf of Mexico and southern Florida. The red mangrove has red trunk roots and is called the walking tree because of its arched prop roots. The black mangrove has dark colored bark and is the largest and tallest of the 3. The white mangrove has light green leaves and greenish white flowers from spring to summer. Each of these are adapted to their particular habitats. Next slide. Red mangroves are typically at the lowest elevation of the 3 and prefer more water. The roots prop it up out of the water so it can take in more oxygen so it doesn't drown. Black mangroves are found upland mangroves at higher elevations and are the most tolerant to the cold of the 3. They grow roots that extend up out of the water and take in oxygen like snorkels. White mangroves are found upland of both red and black mangroves and are least tolerant to the cold. They can obtain oxygen through pores on their lower trunk. Both black and white mangroves expel excess salt not already removed by their roots out of their systems by excretion through their leaves. while red mangroves must wait for the leaves storing the salt to die and fall off. Mangroves are home to snails, barnacles, bryozoans, tunicates, mollusks, sponges, polychaete worms, isopods, amphipods, shrimps, crabs, and jellyfish, as well as several birds and land mammals. Mangroves also provide a natural layer of protection for the coast against erosion from ocean water. Their roots strengthen the soil and the trees themselves act as barriers. Next slide.
Now that we've briefly touched on what mangroves are, we want to touch on what sea level rise is. So just a general statistic, we see sea level rise is increasing by about 3.4 millimeters annually, and this will have a great effect on both the economy and biodiversity of the Gulf Coast. So this is a really fun planning tool brought to you by the University of Florida. And we zoomed into the South Florida area, and you can choose between the USAC or NOAA predictions and decide what interval you'd like to put them in. For this scenario, we put them at a high interval in the time period of 2100. And to the right, you can see the scale. So low levels of sea level rise are going to be lighter blue, while high levels are dark blue. And as we're looking at South Florida, we can see that a majority of the Everglades is going to be consumed by sea level rise by the time of 2100, according to these predictions. Also, another part of this graph is the red lines represent highly affected road systems, and they go down in intervals of orange, yellow, and light red based on how affected the road systems will be. So we just wanted to include this to give you a little background on sea level rise.
So researchers are fairly certain that sea level rise does have a pretty strong impact on mangrove distribution. And the way that they know that, if you look at this image here, this is a paleo coastline of Florida during the Quaternary period. So what researchers can do is they can examine these paleo coastlines, and they can look at the stratigraphic record, and they can find evidence of mangrove forests in the geologic record. And they correlate that data with their knowledge of the sea level during that time. And what that tells us is that mangroves do respond to sea level oscillations and fluctuations. And we can use that data to figure out what might happen in the future if the sea level continues to rise as it did at other points in history. Next slide, please. And in the present, researchers are using technology like remote sensing and satellite data to keep track of mangrove ecosystem distributions and how they move in response to the sea level. If you look at this graph over here to the right, this is a graph of chlorophyll levels in mangroves. Because another thing that they can do with the remote sensing is they can keep track of how healthy the mangroves are and if their health is changing at all in response to the sea level. Next slide.
So here we can see this graph is essentially just made to help conceptualize just how many factors sea level rise would actually affect in terms of mangrove distribution and population. It also shows how difficult the predictions would be to make on mangrove populations and any relocation factors that we would see later. Next slide, please. Here we can see the different effects that sea level rise will have on different ecosystems in Florida. Actually looking at a 1 meter sea level rise would show a 2% increase to the livable land that mangroves would inhabit, which would be about 4,000 hectares. But since sea level rise is not uniform across the globe, these predictions are only relative to Florida's ecosystems. Next slide, please. Okay, here, this kind of goes back to what Kurt was saying earlier. This shows the mangrove distribution by species. So you'll see that at the coastlines, you'll have red followed by black and then white mangroves as you move further inland. If you look at the bottom right image in particular, you'll see that this highlights the 2% increase and shows even that it could be a little bit more for this graphic. The possible new land that mangroves would have with sea level rise. However, this is great in theory, but human interaction probably won't allow that to happen, as things like seawalls, buildings, roads will all be populating this land as well, keeping them from growing. Next slide, please. Here, we're going to talk about some of the benefits that mangroves bring to ecosystems and Florida as a whole. So low island mangroves can actually compensate and negate the effects of about 0.9 millimeters of sea level rise for every 100 years. Their complex root systems provide a wave buffer, which actually helps combat erosion as well. And they also provide a breeding and feeding ground for many fish, shellfish, and birds. Their root systems provide shelter from predatory animals, and the leaves actually fall in and help increase the amount of nutrients in the water for the feeding grounds. Next slide.
All right, going back to what Austin's statement that infrastructure will have an impact on how mangroves will react to sea level rise, I really wanted to restate this because it's really a key instrument in discussing how humans can prevent impacts on mangrove forest habitats. In the future, we just need to be more conscious about where we're developing infrastructure. Next slide, please. Since, like Kurt explained, mangroves are a natural seawall, we really need to be thinking about them as a natural protection and use this to our advantage by allowing space for them to relocate whenever the sea level rises. This is important not only for their habitat, but also for us building infrastructure in the future, since with less erosion, more infrastructure will be able to be developed in the areas. Next slide, please. Now here I'll be discussing the impacts of the degradation of mangroves. In a study comparing undisturbed and disturbed mangroves in Malaysia, they found a lower variety in organic sediment. This is important. Organic sediment is important in the regeneration of mangroves, since with different sediment types, different types of mangroves are able to permeate through that sediment. And additionally, they also found that there were lower levels of prokaryotic biomass. Prokaryotic biomass is essential to the food chain found in these kind of environments. Next slide, please. And then if biodiversity is going to be impacted by sea level rise and those mangroves not being able to move onto the coast because of our infrastructure, we will likely see a decrease in ecotourism on the Gulf Coast. This is really important to understand, since ecotourism brings in about 20 million participants annually, along with $19 billion in annual spending and $5.3 billion in federal, state, and tax revenues. Next slide, please. And then in order to mitigate these effects of sea level rise on mangrove habitats, I'll be discussing some policies that are being enacted currently in states such as Florida. They have regulations, or we have regulations, that require the consideration of sea level rise when reviewing permit applications. Florida also adopted the Community Planning Act. This allows the local government to designate places as adaptation action areas, which means that they're susceptible to sea level rise. And this act prioritizes funding in these areas in order to create, to improve flooding resilience. And then also the Community Resiliency Project provides a collection of research findings and adoption plannings that other policy permits and stuff can look at. And then the DEP's Acquisition and Restoration Council in Florida also helps determine the prioritization of lands for state preservation. Moving on to Louisiana's policies, these are really, really awesome, actually. They have they have a Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which designs and implements coastal protection plans that get revised every 5 years, along with a state master plan, which discusses the state's coastal investments over the next 50 years and describes solutions for coastal protection. All of these policies are going to help mangroves in the end. And then lastly, this photo that we have included is just shows like the fine amounts that you could get from tampering with mangroves. Next slide.
Alrighty. So in conclusion, we'd like to restate the knowledge that mangroves are essential to the biodiversity and natural foundation of coastal areas. In the next 80 years, we are expecting a large shift in the distribution of mangroves, and the way that Florida and other Gulf Coast states deal with their infrastructure and design their implementation strategy is very crucial to making sure that these mangroves have longevity and can continue to grow and prosper. With that being said, without proper sea level rise mitigation policy with mangroves in mind, we may lose this vital resource, if not altogether. And lastly, Gulf Coast states should follow in Louisiana's planning footsteps, looking to either a 50 or 100-year action plan, keeping natural resources in mind. And here are our questions.
Okay, so questions from the audience. The audience is not asking many questions today. Well, I had some questions. So, oops. You showed a slide of the different penalties that had been assessed for, could you go back to that and explain that a little bit better? I didn't quite understand that. Okay, yeah, so what are we seeing here?
I can take this one, Shylin, if you want. We just wanted to add this to touch on different policies, and you can see that in South Florida, the fine is much greater than it is in North Florida, and we think this is due to the distribution of mangroves and how they're much more populated in the South Florida area. Also, that's where a majority of ecotourism destinations are in the state, so tampering with them is probably more of a concern in these areas.
But this is like the sort of total number of penalties that have been assessed, right?
Yes.
So this is, so in the Southeastern District since 1991, there have been $733,000 in fines assessed for mangrove destruction, right?
Yes,
so
sir.
That would reflect the fact that the population is much higher in the Southeast than in the South, right? And there's a whole lot more infrastructure. But still, it's a pretty low number, isn't it? $700,000, you know, that doesn't suggest that there's a huge problem. And, you know, this is a 30-year record of you know, enforcement. I just think this is interesting, because one of the earlier groups also showed this slide, and they could chime in if they have any thoughts on this. And of course, where we are in the Panhandle, there aren't mangroves, or are there mangroves? Are there any mangroves in the Panhandle area?
Anyone else want to take this one? But I want to say no, just from the satellite and distribution graphs. There's a few places, but Austin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, their locations are really, really spotty, but there's very few mangrove. There's not like a whole coastline of mangroves in the Northeast or anything like that, or Northwest, excuse me.
Yeah,
but there are some spotty locations where there are a couple little pockets of a few that have managed to stay there.
Yeah. Okay. And what about the rest of the Gulf? Where are the other mangrove habitats located? Are there some in Louisiana or Texas or any of the other Gulf states? Do you know?
Well, I know Louisiana has a really high mangrove population, like us. Texas, they don't have many because they lack a lot of the marshy area that Louisiana and Florida has. Past that, I didn't really look too far into many of the other states.
Well, that's interesting, because I would have thought that the same sort of climate restrictions would have applied to between Louisiana and the Panhandle. but I guess you're saying that the Louisiana, the habitat is more conducive to mangrove forests than it is. That would be because of the freshwater, the estuary areas. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I would say it's mainly the estuaries that allow for more mangroves in Louisiana than there are in Northwest Florida.
Right,
right. Yeah, because they like those estuaries, and so big rivers that dump out right there.
Okay. All right, well, we are almost out of time. Thanks to all the presenters today for having nice presentations and staying on time. Everybody completed within their time. Nobody went over, and you all have nice questions, and these will show up on the exam. Some of you will know the answers to these questions ahead of time, but that's the little advantage that you get. So I guess we'll just, unless there's other questions or comments, we'll just end the class here. And remember that on Saturday, there will be, I will open up the essay questions that are due for the final. And then you have, there'll be, I think the same thing we did on the midterm, there'll be 15 questions, and you'll have to answer 10 of them. The graduate students will have to answer all 15. And we'll do it that way. And those questions will be due on the 10th. Well, the 9th, I guess, actually, at midnight on the 9th.
Do you know what time those questions will be released, roughly?
I'll try to release them at midnight on Friday, unless something happens and I don't have them quite finished by then. But that's my plan. So midnight tomorrow night. So you'll have plenty of time. Okay, other questions?
When you say midnight on the 9th, do you mean on the 9th in the morning, or?
Well, the assignment will close at midnight on the 9th. So, at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 10th, it's too late. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Okay, because then the 10th, you have your in-class multiple choice questions. Okay.
Because midnight on the 9th implies we have the whole. Do we have the whole day of the 9th, or in the morning on the 9th? The question was.
You have the whole day of the 9th. You have the whole day of the 9th until
11:59 p.m.
11:59 p.m. There you go. Thank you. 11:59 and 59 seconds. So, and hopefully everybody will be done by then. So you won't be waiting until the last possible minute to turn it in. I hope. Okay, everybody. And hey, just a reminder, please fill in the evaluation form for this class. Offering this class entirely remotely is a new experience for me, and any feedback you can give me to try to make this better is helpful. I have to teach a class again next semester, and so I really appreciate the feedback and any other comments you wanted to make. Okay, everybody, we'll have one more session of presentations on Tuesday. And then Thursday at 3 will be the final. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye.